So, I'm talking today about rigidity and flexibility. I'm talking about knowing it all and humility. And I'm talking about having everything locked down and spontaneity. And if we want to grow, if we want to move, if we want to change, if we want to be, if we want to fulfill what we came into this earth to experience, we've got to be humble, flexible, and spontaneous. I am humble, flexible, and spontaneous. Together. I am humble, flexible, and spontaneous. But not with that. Not that one. You know, as I shared at the beginning of the service, when I was growing up, I was 14, and my parents took me to this church, and minister, he actually spoke here many times, Gary Jones. Many of you may have known him. And he was first church, he was in his early 20s, and he was on fire, and he'd heard about this new idea of people turning around in the service and shaking one another's hands. And he didn't last there long. And neither did that church, actually. They had to close it down and open another one. But how do you feel in your life where when something comes and it's a little different than you had in mind? Oh boy, change. I love it. Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. Together, change. I love it. Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. And yet, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for that sometimes. But you know what? This is the most freeing thing in the world. It's the most freeing thing in the world. I remember when I moved 20 years ago to a church, and I started to study with Jane Elizabeth Hart, and she was a teacher in that church, and there was a lot of rigid expectations in that church. For instance, they had two groups. One taught 5-step prayer treatment, the other taught 7-step prayer treatment, and they were separate from each other, and they knew they each had the right way, and they asked me, which one did I believe in? And I just laughed. I don't even know what I said. I didn't even answer. You know, Joseph Campbell was a great mythologist. He studied all the world religions, and he went to Japan, and he didn't know anything about Shintoism. He wanted to learn about Shintoism, so he went to the top Shinto priest, and he asked him, what's your theology? I want to learn your theology. And he started laughing. And he said, what's so funny? He says, theology, we just dance. We just dance. Dancing with God. And so in this church with the 7-step and the 5-step and all this stuff, and they had certain ways of doing things, and they had a very specific unity curriculum, which, by the way, was quite well written, and I agreed with all of it. But I was told, here, you must take this and teach it. And I looked through it, and I agreed with all of it. I thought it was great. And my heart said, no, I would teach Myrtle Fillmore, I teach Emily Cady, I teach Charles Fillmore, I teach Lessons in Truth, but I'm going to teach Unity 101, and somebody else could teach it. It would be wonderful for those people who wanted to have something that structured. But that's not what I grew up with. Not to say there was anything wrong with the belief system. I've shared many times before, your religious belief system has a value. Like a cup has a value, but the cup's not the coffee. The coffee is the spiritual essence. The real value is found in the spirituality. The cup is needed to hold it. I mean, otherwise you're going to burn your hands. So you got to have a cup, but people are walking around with empty cups, worshiping the cup. Oh, my great cup. And your cup looks different than mine. Mine's ceramic and yours is plastic, and how dare you. And so we are in love with the form, and we forget the essence. Jesus said, you know, it's the spirit of the law. Live by the spirit of the law, not the letter of it. And yet so often we get stuck in certain rigid forms. So in that church, we found as a staff that we could sense that we were stuck, that there was a certain way of doing things, and how are we going to get past this? And one of the staff members who were brainstorming came up with the idea. They said, I went to the Unity Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas. This is 20 years ago. And they had gone through some major traumas and changes. And they came up with the idea of doing an entire service with the chairs turned around facing to the back of the room. And so people are going, ooh. And so back there, the talk would be given and everything, and everybody would be turned around. And some people left the church over it, but it freed up the energy, and that church started to thrive again. Ugh. You think, how could something like that? But you know, sometimes getting out of your comfort zone is a good thing. I'm going to get out of my comfort zone. Together, I'm going to get out of my comfort zone. Be willing to to let go of your agenda and open up to a vision. What's the difference? An agenda is my idea, Greg's idea of what the good is. And a vision is what? Well, God's idea, Spirit's idea, the soul idea, and it's not what I have in mind. So we talked about maybe doing that, except for somebody pointed out, we have bolted down pews. We can't turn them around. Well, what do we do now? And I don't know who it came to. Maybe it was me. It was like, why don't we take the order of service and just do the whole thing backward? We'll start with a closing statement. We'll go into the prayer for protection. Then we'll sing the peace song. And then we'll just go all the way back through the service. And somebody said, yeah, but all these people come in late. What about the offering? Okay, we'll put the offering towards the end of it. But everything else we're going to do. So somebody had that idea. So we didn't announce it. We didn't tell anybody what was going to happen. Do you know, for some people, that was just more than they could take. The ushers, a couple of them were saying, people were walking in, usually late, and saying, I don't even know what's going on in this church anymore. None of it makes any sense. And walked out and we never saw them again. But for many people, it was funny. It was fun. They had a playful sense because you're dancing with God. I'm dancing with God. Together, I'm dancing with God. And we got a new energy, we got a new life, and things started picking up. And I'm not saying that we should turn the chairs around or whatever, but I'm saying that there's something that needs to be addressed within our souls, within ourselves, where we need to engage with life with a sense of newness. With what? Flexibility, spontaneity, and humility. Humility, being humble enough to know that we don't have all the answers. I got an idea, and I should have an idea. You shouldn't go through life with no idea. But then you got to let go of your idea. You take your agenda, which is on a clipboard, written on legal pad, and you turn it over and you receive a vision. You open up to a vision. So you let go of your agenda and you receive a vision. And what's an agenda? It's Greg's idea. And what's a vision? A vision is the higher idea. And you can't have both sometimes. You have to be willing to let that go. I remember in ministerial school, they had us create a vision of what we had for ministry. So we wrote basically a goal list or a vision board or whatever it is of our ideas or vision for ministry. Nothing wrong with that. And then they said, well, I want you to write down 3 things that you absolutely will not do in ministry or experience, places, whatever the thing is. So I wrote down, I never want to be an associate minister because who needs that? I never want to be in Los Angeles because I don't like LA. And I'll never teach, I never have a church in the industrial Midwest because, it's just too conservative. My first church was the closest church in the Unity to downtown LA. I was there for 6 years. I had the most marvelous time, and I loved the place. No, I didn't like the traffic or the smog, but I liked a whole lot of other things. The Chinese food was so good. I'll never get over it. But the people were great, too, and I had a wonderful experience. I had to let go of my rigidity. The industrial Midwest. 20 years in the industrial Midwest. I loved it. Now, I never went to Cleveland, but when I was teaching or I was leading a church in Detroit, Cleveland Chamber of Commerce had an unofficial slogan. They actually made a video with a song that went, "At least we're not Detroit." I loved Detroit. I loved Chicago. I loved suburban Kansas City. I loved the Midwest. It was great. Because I had to let go of, and you know what? You get these ideas, you get locked down. I'm there. Nope, no way. It's okay to know what you want. It's also okay to let go of it and to know when to hold and when to fold and know when it's time to do something different than you had in mind. How about being an associate minister? Well, that was interesting. I was in Hawaii. I'd been there for 3 years. And I'd just come from a minister's conference where there was a circle of people at lunch. And somebody said, well, where could you live? Where would you live if you could live anywhere in the world? And somebody said Paris. A couple of them said, I'd live where you live, because I was like overlooking the beach on, Kailua. And I said Palo Alto, California. But there was a big Unity church there, and the senior minister was there. I used to work for him when I was in ministerial school. There's no way. But that's what I said. So I'm sitting on my lanai overlooking this beautiful view, knowing, and I'd gotten guidance in the Peace Chapel at Unity Village, that it was time for me to seek placement. I'm done there. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm just letting go. I just let it all go. I just let it all go. And I got let go, my strongest feeling. Let go of all your pictures. Today is the day. Let go of all your pictures. Today is today. What does that mean? I don't like it. If you got the guidance, let go of all your pictures, how would you feel? Well, I like my pictures. Thank you very much. I worked very hard to come up with those pictures. They're my idea of what's good. And they included, I would never be an associate minister. Well, anyway, I didn't really know what it was about. I get in my car, I drive to the church, I show up, and there is the minister's newsletter, and there are the openings, and there's a new opening, the associate minister in Palo Alto. And I knew the minister there. He'd been my boss when I'd been in ministerial school when I was running the Youth of Unity. And so I think, could that be it? But you know what? If it was, I'd get a sign. I drive home, and my answering machine's blinking, and I know that that's it. I just knew it was him. And yep, sure enough, he said, Greg, call me up, we'll have a laugh. I know you have no interest, you set it off in ever being an associate minister, and that you love where you live on your beach, etc. But call me up and we'll have a laugh because we wrote the job description with you in mind. And I'm going, oh, well, I don't know. Well, it turns out two things. My grandmother, who lived 40 minutes away, was going to go into hospice that year, and I got to be with her while she was dying. And we got so close, and it was a beautiful experience. Plus, being in a church that was about double the size of this church, and this was back in the 80s, the next church I came to was this church for 7 years. And if I hadn't had experience in a larger church, they never would have looked at me. In other words, it was really necessary for me to have that experience, but it wasn't what I had in mind. Sometimes what we have in mind is limited. Sometimes through our so-called limitations, we learn the most. And sometimes we have no idea what's going to happen, but we know it's good. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I know it's good. Together? I have no idea what's going to happen, but I know it's good. And so in that church we had that one church, we returned the chairs around. We had an experience of dancing with God. And we began to do church differently. We began to open up to new ideas. We ended up with 85 different activities every week. We ended up doing things completely off the chain and off the hook and out of the charts and out of the comfort zone. In your life, you have an idea of what is good, and there's a time when you need to let go of it and try something new and do something new. And you're saying to yourself, well, does that mean I'm supposed to do something radical, do something drastic, do something geographical, do something dramatic? No. 90% of the time, it means you hold the experiences that you're going through in a new way. You see things with new eyes. You do what you're doing with a whole new level of perspective, and you stop seeing your environment as needing to meet your rigid ego ideas of what is good. And you open up, and you let go of that agenda to a vision. There's a woman I heard talk about a near-death experience. And in her near-death experience, it was like a lot of the others. She was there on the other side, and she said, I mentally turned, and I did my review of my life. You know, when your life passes before your eyes. I did a review of my life, and my reaction was I started laughing. In a non-physical state, on the other side, I laughed uproariously because I realized that I wasn't Pam. I'd spent my entire life thinking I was Pam, the personality self, the limited ego. And I'd spent all my time thinking that's who I was, and I wasn't. And the closest thing I could come to it was Pam was like a little piece on a Monopoly board. And it moves around, and it gets experiences and gets points and does different things and learns things and all kinds of things, but it's not who I am. I am the I am that I am, and I'm the one moving the piece around. There's a spiritual essence in each one of us that's moving the piece around. That piece, that little ego self, is an important experience in your life, but there's something greater. It's the Christ in you, it's the divinity in you, it's that which needs an expression in your life, but you got to be willing to let go of what? Your agenda, and open up to a vision. And she said that when she came, she was given a choice that she could come back and have more experiences as the little chess piece or the little Monopoly piece, the little personality self, but she would do it from a very different perspective because she realized that that was not who she was, that the I am that I am was who she was. And so she had a choice between that and going on into that next level of being. And she chose to come back because she said that she was shown that it would make a big difference in terms of learning for some of the loved ones in her life. Not for herself, because she kind of liked it over there, but she said, this is something that I did for the people around me. But she said, ever since then, I lived my life in a very different way. And they found that with people with near-death experiences. They found that with people who have overcome terminal illnesses. That there's a perspective shift where they stop living their life according to what? The agenda, not only of their own ego, what they thought was good, but what everybody else tells them is good. What everybody else. So you stop saying to yourself, I got to keep peace in my family and keep everybody happy. And you start doing that which gives your soul happiness. And you stop doing that which makes your ego happy, and you start doing that which makes your soul happy. And you stop doing that which fits you into the prescribed systems of thought. And you start living from experience. Your spirituality stops being a secondhand spirituality that somebody in front of the room is telling you about. And you start practicing it, and you start experiencing it. You become the experience that you're seeking. You become the spirituality you're seeking. I remember in ministerial school, a guy was trying to insult me one time. He says, Greg, you're a real experience. And I said, thank you. Because experience is the highest order. That's what we're here to do. We're here not to just sleepwalk through life, not to be asleep, but to experience. There's some wonderful stories about Jesus trying to get people to wake up. And you know, sometimes Jesus was rude. Lucky for Jesus, he was not a minister. Jesus was not a minister. He was a teacher. And the word in Hebrew and Aramaic was rabbi, right? So, but that didn't mean the head of a structured synagogue or organization. It meant just simply teacher, itinerant teacher. He didn't have any ecclesiastical authority to tell him what he could and couldn't teach. And he had some interesting things to say to people, and sometimes they were not politically correct. For instance, there was one of the great experts of the law. He was called a scribe, and the scribes were the people that copied down all the scriptures, and they were actually like the lawyers or the experts that people would go to interpret the law. And this scribe was taken with Jesus, and of course the scribes were very much filled with their own theology and their own belief system. And the scribe said to him, I want to follow you. And Jesus said, well, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place even to lay his head down and sleep. What does that mean? That means that there was no place you could fall asleep in some kind of, perhaps a belief system, some kind of a rigid structure, that there's no outer structure in which you could fall asleep, that it was something you're going to have to wake up to within your own being. And then right after that, somebody walked up to him and said that I'd like to follow you, but I have to go home and bury my father, which meant spend the year of rituals you had to do, and then they dig up the grave, and then they put the bones in a second grave, and they do that, and it's a whole big thing the oldest son had to do. And Jesus said, let the dead bury their own dead. You follow me. Whoa! That would get him in a lot of trouble. And yet he was trying to get him to see there's a window of opportunity I shared last week. There's a time in your life when it's time to make a shift in your consciousness, a time to make a shift in your awareness, to stop living so small, to stop putting up with the limitations that you are putting on yourself, and perhaps to embrace things that look like limitations but are actually opening you up to something bigger by surrendering to something higher, being humble, being flexible, and being spontaneous. Allowing yourself to experience the spontaneity of life. And I think there was a third person right after that who came up to Jesus and said, I want to follow you, but I got to go home and say goodbye. And he said, if you put your hand to the plow and you look back, you're not fit for service in the kingdom of God. What is that? That probably meant he probably lived far away. It would probably be a hard time for him to get back together, and they'd probably talk him out of it. And so Jesus was trying to say, hey, seize the moment. Be in the moment. He's talking to us, not about the events in life, but about being in the now moment, about being in that spontaneous, flexible, humble consciousness that is open to all life, that's open to all good, that is willing to see things in a completely new way. When I was going through that experience in that church, and Jane Hart was my teacher for the first time, she was a teacher in the church, and she gave me an instruction which reminded me a lot of Karate Kid. You remember where the Karate Kid went to Mr. Miyagi and he wanted to be a student, and what did he tell him to do instead? paint fences. Remember that? And what did the painting fences teach him? Everything he needed to know. It taught him the balance. It taught him to dance. It taught him all the true experiences of his martial arts, his spirituality. And so Jane looked at me and said, first thing you got to do is take ballroom dancing. Ballroom dancing. I mean, I'm a deadhead, so I dance like this, you know? I'm not like, you know, don't ask me to do. And I took ballroom dancing, and let me tell you, this literally happened. I had one person come up to me when I was practicing saying, "Are you okay? You look like you're in pain." And I had somebody else say, "You don't look like you're having a good time out here at all." And I was going, 1, 2, cha, cha, cha. And you know something, that's not dancing. But she was trying to get me out of myself and get me flexible and humble. Because you see, if you could do the thing that you're wanting to do spiritually, well, you'd already be doing it. So it's going to look awkward. You're going to have people look at you and say, "Are you okay? You're not like you used to be." Well, have you ever had that? When you make a change in your life, when you start to open up your life, you're just not the way you used to be. And you know, the implication is that you're not okay. You used to be a lot better. Well, you're probably better at being that person that you used to be, but now you're opening up to new skills. Maybe you're learning different things. How about Jesus? You know, he always approached everything in the moment, and he never got locked down in theology. He never got locked down. His methods of healing and prayer were always different. For one person, they would touch the hem of his garment. Somebody else, he'd go to their place. Another one, he wouldn't even see him. One of them, he'd say, "Show yourself to the priest." Another one, he'd say, "Don't speak a word of it to anybody." There were even times he made mud pies and slapped them on their eyes. Or another, he spit in their eyes. Imagine if they turned that into a sacrament. That would have been just awful. But what am I telling you this for? Because he wasn't locked down. Because the different people he dealt with had different needs, different belief systems, different psychologies, and they all need to be dealt with differently. He had to be flexible, spontaneous, and humble. Humble enough that he wasn't going to just slap everybody with the same thing all the time. He was always open and always spontaneous. And spirituality is like that. That's why unity is not locked down in theology. And I want to share a little bit about unity. When I was in that church and they had that teaching of Unity 101, Unity Basics, it was all really good stuff. But Fillmore's, they didn't teach it like that. They weren't structured. They didn't have a doctrine or a theology that was rigidly held. Although something interesting happened when I was teaching a class, it was actually in this church 20-something years ago, a new member class, and I shared that with the new member class, that unity is an experiential religion, not dogmatic, and that we don't have a set of doctrines that you must adhere to, etc., etc. And the next week, this wonderful woman walked up to me and handed me this tattered old pamphlet that said, Unity Statements of Belief. And it was written by Charles Fillmore, and I'm reading it, and I agreed with all of them. There were like 39 beliefs. And I thought, this isn't what, I didn't know this. So I took it to James Dillett Freeman, who was a friend of mine, and I said, what about this? And of course, he knew Charles Fillmore intimately, and he said, Charles Fillmore complained about having to write that for the rest of his life. He said, they put me up to it. They wanted me to write something down, so I did, and he regretted it the rest of his life. But even though it was good, but he never wanted to be locked down. When I was a child in the Youth of Unity, I had a teacher, ministers, the two ministers, the woman minister was our teacher, and she shared that she and her husband took classes with Charles Fillmore in the 1940s. And one time Charles Fillmore said the famous quote, "I reserve the right to change my mind." And another time, some student showed up with a Charles Fillmore book, and Fillmore taught something, and he opened it. He said, well, on page 27, you say thus and such, it's different. And Fillmore says, well, I don't believe that anymore. Imagine that. Didn't believe his own. Now you say to yourself, well, I'd like to have some certainty in my theology. I had a woman, it was the coolest thing. She was coming through the line after the 9:30 service, and she said, you know, I came here this morning. I'm new. I came to find a good book on unity theology, and I was going to ask you after the service, now what do I do? And I said, get the book by Charles Fillmore, The Story of Unity. The Story of Unity teaches every teaching in unity, but in the context of the experience of unity. the history of unity, but every single teaching is in there, but it's done in context of experience, not in terms of you must believe this, and this. And it's a wonderful thing, although I think I've shared this before, that James Philip Freeman, who wrote that book, The Story of Unity, he said the original version was 3 times longer, and they edited all the really good parts out because the Fillmores really had to grapple with some really tough issues in their lives, and they did so successfully. But some of the people after Charles Fillmore died thought it was all too negative, so they took it out. But really, some of the stories then that came out later were even more dramatic and more moving and more appropriate for our lives today. However, the book that you can get now, The Story of Unity, is perfectly good, and it teaches all of our teachings. There'll probably be a run on it, so I guess maybe you can order a copy of it or something. But the point being that unity is an experiential teaching, not a dogmatic one. It's not rigid. It's flexible, spontaneous, and humble. Charles Fillmore always said, Myrtle Fillmore especially said, that I remember I read a letter from somebody to her in her last year of her life, and they asked her what unity taught about thus and such, and she said, rather than being so worried about what unity teaches, why not go within your own being and find out what your spiritual essence teaches you? That's where you're going to be really taught, because there is that in you that leads you to all truth. And she didn't even answer their question. It was pretty powerful. But this is the openness. This is the spontaneity. This is the humility. This is that flexibility. And so when we get too rigid, when we get too locked in, when we get locked into a little comfort zone, we have situations in our lives that teach us to dance. You know, Kurt Vonnegut said that peculiar travel arrangements are dancing lessons from God. And I learned really how to dance when I went hitchhiking around the country back in 1972. And my parents said, if you hitchhike around the country, you have to put yourself through college. And I said, okay. And I put myself through school. I lived in a little shack next to a pigsty and sold brushes door to door and put myself through school. True story. But that summer was something I'll never get over. And my parents told me that because they said it's dangerous. And you know what? They were right. I had some experiences that were amazing. I mean, I had these 2 guys who were so drunk. I'd never seen anybody drunker in my life. And they were driving down the Interstate 10 in West Texas like this, through all 3 lanes or whatever. And I tried to talk them into letting me drive, and they were saying that I was going to drive them to Rio de Janeiro. And one was saying to the other one, you shouldn't have killed that guy back at the bank robbery. I mean, this stuff was, you know, I had a couple of soldiers who wanted to argue politics, and maybe, you know, I had a little bit long hair, maybe, you know, something could happen to me. But I had something in my favor. Every morning I would put the hands of God like this, like the Allstate, good hands with Allstate. But it's the hands of God, my visualization, for about 5 or 10 minutes. And I put myself there hitchhiking in the hands, and I put a cone of light coming down, and I would affirm divine order, divine guidance, divine grace, love, peace, and different affirmations. And I got protection and guidance. I even had somebody who said he was going to put a gun to my head if I didn't do certain things, and I said, go ahead and shoot. And he said, what? And we had this conversation, and all about cosmic truth and life after death and all kinds of stuff. And when he let me out, he said I was the only person he'd ever let out of the car. I don't know. I mean, it was pretty rough stuff. But I learned from this, I learned tremendously that dancing with God, if you will do your spiritual preparation, and I did that every morning, if you'll take the time to prepare yourself and then be flexible, I'm not saying you should put yourself at risk, but I did learn a lot from that experience. But put yourself in a position where you're open to the spontaneity of life, where you're dancing with God, and where everything is an adventure in your life. You're not locked down in your comfort zone. So why don't we take a moment here and just once again remember ourselves that we are infinite consciousness, infinitely expressing. We are not that personality self, like that woman with a near-death experience. We can look down, in a sense, upon our personality self on the board game of life and just say, no, that's not who I am. That is just what I'm doing, and I'm learning. It has value, but the who that I am is something much, much greater. And I am willing to live from that higher self. I'm willing to be the director in the play, not the actor. I'm willing to be the player, not the board piece. I'm willing to be the higher self, not that lower limited self. And I make a commitment to my own beingness right here and right now, that I live with spontaneity and flexibility. I live with humility. And I open up. I open up and I dance with God. Thank you, God. So it is. Amen.